Atomic Robo-Kid, one of those awesome shoot-em-ups that barely anybody ever talks about. I see social media posts talking about classic shoot-em-ups all the time. All of the obvious games in the genre from R-Type, Darius, Gradius and so on. Very rarely, if not at all, do I ever see or read anything about this absolutely terrific 1988 UPL arcade game. And it baffles me, it's likely one of the best games out there from the late 1980s. So what is Atomic Robo-Kid? It's a bit of a strange and out there name, isn't it? Well, in a nutshell, the game is set in the 21st century, and bear in mind, when this game was released, it was actually the 20th century, and so the 21st century seemed pretty distant at the time. So anyways, an outpost of Earth known as Terra 12 was contaminated by a sudden burst of radiation. This in turn mutated everything on Terra 12. Meanwhile, alien governors followed the radiation trail and thus invaded the planet, killing off all of the remaining life. A combination of radiation and alien invasions pretty much annihilated all sentient life as well as transplanted life on Terra 12. So we play as Robo-Kid, and our mission is to wipe out the alien governor bosses through 6 stages. And some of these bosses are impressively massive in the original game. We get the 8 different weapons to use throughout the game, as well as having the ability to switch between weapons as we are playing. We also get an option to choose which route we take through the game rather than it being a more linear shoot 'em up. We can also fly Robo-Kid around in all directions, which we often need in order to shoot down enemies that come from behind us. So we have some fairly good ports of this classic, and today we are ranking from worst to best the home conversions of the very awesome 1988 UPL classic Atomic Robo-Kid. Now, surprisingly, the Commodore 64 was the only 8-bit computer to actually have a port of Atomic Robo-Kid. The ZX Spectrum was supposed to have its own version, and even a demo was distributed at the time, but was ultimately cancelled. So, on with the Commodore 64 game itself then. Well, firstly, I actually think this conversion isn't actually too bad. I have proved over and over again, and it is common knowledge that a mere 8-bit computer would always find it difficult getting a perfect arcade game. Memory constraints, limited colour palettes, you know the score. But for what it is, Atomic Robo-Kid for the C64 by Activision that released back in 1990 isn't that bad at all. Yes, we are missing background music, but the sound effects aren't too bad, and the gameplay itself carries its own, even though it is missing particular enemy sprites, including the propeller wheels that we see in the arcade game. Not sure if you noticed, but the artwork for the C64 game actually has the propeller next to Robo-Kid, but of course in the game we don't actually get this. So pretty much false advertising, but this was the early 1990s and it happens more often than not. Sprites are of course small in comparison, and they are fairly blocky here too. But bear in mind, it wouldn't have originally looked like this, most certainly if you were using a CRT TV like myself back in the day, or even a Commodore monitor. This game would have looked good, and those huge blocks of pixels wouldn't have been so prevalent back then. But it is what it is, and Robo-Kid surprisingly scrolls fairly nicely, and it's very nice to control too. There are barely any frame drops here, and that's likely that Activision realised the C64's limits and likely decided to tone it down for the game to run smoother. As I travelled through the various levels of Terra 12, I ended up on the first boss. Now, I was expecting it to be a challenge. Most certainly the arcade game leaves the player slightly crammed for room to manoeuvre around, but here the gigantic boss stays static. And all we really have to do is just stay in one place and shoot him until he blows up. Robo-Kid also doesn't have the magnificent explosion animation when he's being hit. Like I say, the C64 version is a great game for what it is, but in the context of this video, I have ranked it this low as it's missing a fair bit of what it's attempting to port over for the original arcade release. I had mixed opinions with the Atari ST's conversion of Atomic Robo-Kid. On one hand, and as to be expected for the Atari ST, the speed this version runs at is fairly slow compared with other versions in this video, but over time I have adjusted to this within every other arcade ports video I've ever done. The real issue is with this release was that there's just far too much happening on screen at times, and sure, it is much like the arcade game itself, and everything looks and certainly sounds great too, but those times when too many sprites are on the screen at once seriously affects any enjoyment from the game. The more crowded the screen gets, the more laggy the game becomes, and it very quickly becomes very difficult to play the game in terms of maneuvering around to avoid bullets. It is a good version, and like I said, most certainly looks the part for sure. I think from a technical standpoint, Activision, who released it in 1990, should have done what the Commodore 64 version had done and totally toned down the amount of sprites entering the screen at any one given time. I get it that it's going for the full arcade look, but sometimes particular computers and even consoles could not cope with so much, and this particular game is evidenced by this. Everything else though is pretty much there, including a flashy looking visuals for when collecting new weapons, and selecting the different weapons to use is very easy here to use in this version. Just hold down on the fire button for a couple of seconds, which simply switches between different weapons that you have collected. But really, this game got so difficult to play through its poor frame drops that I could not actually make it past the second stage, which was a real shame. I was actually quite surprised with the performance of the Commodore Amiga's 1990 Activision release of Atomic Robo-Kid. Generally, throughout this series, it's normally the case where Amiga versions of particular games play at significant speeds compared to that of the Atari ST's versions. Although this version does of course play slightly faster, it's not actually much faster than I was expecting it to be. It just feels very clunky and choppy most of the time. Now, I have tested this on my real Amiga 600, and just like this recorded emulated version you are watching, both perform roughly around the same. It's not a completely unplayable game where it struggles to run correctly if too much is happening at once, which is where the ST's version suffered most, but it could have run much smoother than what it actually did. Clearly, the music and sound effects are a major upgrade for this Amiga conversion compared to the ST's version, but generally and graphically it's pretty much the same looking game here. The same buttons are used here to switch between weapons, which is of course holding down on the fire button for a couple of seconds. A real shame that Amiga had an almost sluggish version of Atomic Robo-Kid. Hit collision detection, just like the other versions covered so far in this video, was pretty much spot on and absolutely no issues there. I'd say if you had this originally on its release, it's likely a perfectly fine game really, but in comparison videos where we are comparing the same game across multiple platforms, things like this need to be mentioned even if it does sound slightly nitpicking. This PC Engine 1990 Japanese exclusive version by UPL was actually titled Atomic Robo-Kid Special. Although this is a fairly decent version of the game, the levels are very strange as opposed to every other version here in this video. For example, every version of the game has generally followed the same starting level as the arcade game itself, but with this PC Engine version, the first level is actually something different here, which, like I say, seems very bizarre. It continues like this throughout the game, and just as I was getting used to the same pattern of levels in the game, this version changed it entirely. Another little strange feature with this version is having iconic little sprites appear from time to time from entirely different arcade games, such as Ninja Kid, who is of course a fairly big arcade icon from the 1980s. By catching these little icons or little sprites, we actually benefit from achieving an extra life. We also have a health bar included here too, which seems to give the the player several chances before we are entirely blown up to lose a life altogether. One thing which I thought was a little bit of a downgrade was that flashy neon animation which zooms in when collecting new weapons. We have no options menu to change difficulty levels of the game, and the default level of difficulty is average. It scrolls nicely enough and doesn't appear to choke its guts out as we play against many enemies on screen at once. I also found the first boss had fairly bad sprite flicker. It's not overly a bad version, and the original arcade levels are here. They just appear to be jumbled around from everything else in this video, like I said. It's definitely not the worst version of the game by any means though. It looks nice and colourful and also has a fairly good conversion of the arcade music and sound effects. This is the Sega Genesis version of the game, which released by Treco in 1990 for Japan and North America in 1991. There was no European release, and all I'll say is that Europeans had a little less stress about this game being released. Damn, this is a tough version of Atomic Robo-Kid. We have an options menu, as most Genesis games have. We have an option to increase or decrease the difficulty levels from easy to hard. Now, I tried the normal option and found it ridiculously impossible, so I changed it to easy, and it is still what I would call hard. So if you love a game of Atomic Robo-Kid with the toughest challenge possible, then this Sega Genesis version is likely it. It even surpasses the difficulty level of the arcade game itself. As for the game itself then, it's fine. I mean, at this point, it is the smoothest scrolling game and brightest version of it too. It is presented in a slightly zoomed out look where we get to see more of the gameplay areas. The music and sound effects are sounding much more like the arcade game itself here, and it sounds just awesome. There is one thing that I have discovered over the years, is that Mega Drive or Sega Genesis don't shy away from giving us an awesome shoot 'em up despite the difficulty levels. There are parts missing from the arcade original, of course. Normally after completing certain levels we get an animation of Robo-Kid flying into the sky. Well, this isn't actually included with this version at all, but on the plus side, the first main boss is pretty impressively done here, and it certainly is the biggest version of the boss at this point in the video too. Like I say, this is an incredible version, make no doubt about it. To make it even better is that we can change between weapons using a dedicated button on the Genesis controller, rather than having to hold down on fire button for a couple of seconds. It also features no time limit to get through missions, but to be fair, at this point in this video, every version so far has also taken this away for some reason. And in first place, I've ranked the Sharp X68000 conversion. Now, this Sharp X68000 release is pretty much on par with the original arcade game itself. UPL released this back in 1990, and in some ways it's more of a remaster, so to speak, or so it seems. Firstly then, the big noticeable difference here is the music and sound effects in this version. It sounds like the music has had a new layer of it, and it sounds fresh and a little more upbeat, although the same music is used as arcade release itself. We pretty much get the full game here, including cutscenes and starting the game in the exact same way as the arcade game itself. What's really good about this X68000 port is that we get an options menu here too. Apart from this version, the only one to have this was the Sega Genesis version, but here we actually get an easier version of the game itself. If we choose easy, that is, it's not insanely difficult. I'd even go as far to say that the visuals have had also a slight overhaul too. It looks much more visually striking here, especially when collecting new weapons. That neon target which zooms in looks pretty incredible, especially on an OLED screen playing this version. It also appears to be less pixelated too, and edges around sprites and objects are much more smoothed out as opposed to the arcade game itself. And that's it for ranking every version of Atomic Robo-Kid today. Like I said at the start of the video, definitely an underrated game, and I don't necessarily necessarily think there was really a bad version of this game. Some, of course, ran slower than others, but in general, I think I've seen a lot worse in terms of arcade conversions on particular platforms. Anyways, did you play this game in the arcade? Which version did you have? Was you lucky enough to have the awesome Japanese Sharp X68000 back in the day? Anyways, as always, let us know in the comments, and which version do you think should have won? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.